The Origin hub was less of a space station and more of a collective mechanical tumor growing on the side of a dead asteroid. It smelled of recycled oxygen, ozone, and the desperation of 3,000 souls who had nowhere else to go. I pushed through the crowd, my boots clicking against the rusted deck plating of the lower ward. My head was pounding with the rhythm of a malfunctioning fusion core, a souvenir from a late night with a bottle of synthetic bourbon and a complete lack of self-preservation. In my jacket pocket, the biodrive felt like it weighed 50 kilograms. It was a cold, obsidian-colored cylinder that supposedly contained enough corporate dirt to buy me a private moon or get me space before sunrise. Probably the latter. To crack the encryption, I needed a specialist. Not just any specialist, but someone with a nervous system capable of interfacing with Xylo-Thane biologic. And according to the whispers in the dark corners of the hub, the only one left in this sector was currently occupying a booth at the Void Bolt. The bar was a cavern of flickering neon and shadows. I spotted her immediately. She sat in the back, shrouded in a field of silence that seemed to repel the chaotic noise of the room. She was Xylo-Thane, no doubt about it. Her skin had that characteristic metallic sheen, like burnished silver under moonlight, and her eyes were a flat, glowing amber that tracked every movement in the room with predatory precision. I checked my internal clock. 2,100 hours. I was running out of time. Ether Sync had bounty hunters scouring the upper wards, and it was only a matter of minutes before they started checking the slums. I took a breath, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the silver-skinned Reaper. She didn't look up when I approached. Her hands were wrapped around a glass of clear liquid, her long, elegant fingers ending in nails that looked sharp enough to peel hull plating. Her species didn't have ears like humans. Instead, fine filaments along her jawline vibrated slightly as I moved. "The booth is taken, human," she said. Her voice was a low, melodic hum that felt like it was vibrating directly inside my skull. "I've been told I'm very good at sharing," I said, sliding into the seat opposite her. I flashed my most disarming smile, the one that usually got me out of trouble or into bed. Though with her, I suspected it would only get me a broken jaw. "The name's Valen Thorn, but you probably already know that, if you're as good as they say." She finally lifted her gaze. The amber eyes were cold, devoid of the usual human emotions like pity or curiosity. "I know that you are currently being tracked by 4 mercenaries who are currently 3 floors above us. I also know that your heart rate is elevated and you smell like cheap regret. Leave." Ouch! Straight for the jugular. I leaned back, trying to look casual despite the fact that my internal sensors were screaming at me to run. "Look, I'm in a bit of a jam. A high-stakes, life or death, potentially changing the galaxy kind of jam. I need a tech with your unique capabilities." "I am not a technician," she said, her voice dropping an octave. "I am a weapon, and weapons do not do favors for scavengers." "I'm not asking for a favor. I'm offering a contract. 15,000 credits for 2 hours of your time. You plug into this drive, you bypass the biogate, and we both walk away richer." 15,000. One of her jaw filaments flickered. A sign of interest? Or maybe just calculation. "The gate must be lethal. Only EtherSync uses biologic that requires Xylo-Thane input, which means you stole from them, which means you are a dead man walking." "I prefer the term temporarily displaced survivor," I countered. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the biodrive, setting it on the table between us. The obsidian surface seemed to pulse with a faint violet light. 20,000. 10 now. 10 when we're done." She looked at the drive, then back at me. "Your species is fascinating. You have such a short lifespan, yet you spend so much of it trying to shorten it even further. You know what happens when a human touches a Xylo-Thane in an active state, Valen. I've heard stories. Something about a static discharge that feels like being kicked by a freight hauler?" "Worse," she whispered, leaning forward. The metallic sheen of her skin seemed to intensify. "Our skin is a bioelectrical interface. We do not touch. We exchange. If you touch me without my permission, your nervous system will attempt to process my sensory input. You will experience every kill I have ever made, every scream I have ever heard, and every volt of electricity running through my veins. Your brain will melt." I swallowed hard. "Good thing I'm wearing gloves then." "Gloves do not stop the resonance," she said, her amber eyes locking onto mine. Touch me and I will kill you. Not because I want to, but because your body will simply stop functioning. Duly noted, I said, though I felt a bead of sweat roll down my neck. So do we have a deal, Nix? She froze at the mention of her name. The filaments along her jaw went rigid. How do you know that name? I'm a scavenger, I said, my voice softening. I find things, including records of elite soldiers who were supposedly KIA during the Epsilon Purge, but somehow ended up hiding in a basement on Orizon. I know you were the best they had, and I know you're not just a weapon. Her hand moved so fast I didn't even see it. One moment her glass was on the table, the next her fingers were centimeters from my throat. I could feel the air humming around her skin, a low-frequency vibration that made the hair on my arms stand up. You are playing a very dangerous game, human, she hissed. I know, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my blood. But I really need that drive opened. And I think you need a reason to get off this rock before EtherSync decides to clean up their old messes. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 seconds. The tension between us was a physical thing, a cord of static energy stretched to the breaking point. Then she slowly withdrew her hand. Half up front, she said, and if you ever use that name again, I will make sure your death is slow enough for you to regret every choice that led you to this bar. Deal, I said, exhaling a breath I didn't know I was holding. I tapped my comm unit, initiating the transfer of 10,000 credits to her encrypted account. The ship is in Bay 9-4. We should move. My friends from upstairs are probably done with their drinks by now. As we stood up, the door to the bar kicked open. 4 men in tactical gear, bearing the sleek, predatory logo of EtherSync, stepped into the light. Their lead scanner panned the room and locked onto us. Target sighted, the lead grunt barked. Engage! Nix didn't even look at me. Run, Scavenger. Try not to die in the next 30 seconds. She didn't reach for a gun. She didn't need to. She moved like a blur of silver light, a liquid shadow that defied the laws of inertia. I didn't stay to watch. I grabbed the biodrive and bolted for the back exit, hearing the sounds of bones snapping and the sizzle of high-voltage discharge behind me. I made it to the alleyway, my lungs burning. I had a Xylo-Thane mercenary, a drive that could kill me, and an army of corporate goons on my tail. This was definitely the best business decision I'd made all year, or the last one I'd ever make. The air in the cargo tunnels was thick with the smell of grease and ancient failure. I was running hard, my boots skidding on the slime-slicked metal floor. Behind me, I could hear the rhythmic thud of tactical boots. EtherSync didn't send the cheap labor for jobs like this. These were cleaners, the kind of guys who didn't leave witnesses and definitely didn't accept apologies. Valen, you idiot, I muttered to myself, ducking behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. You just had to take the Obsidian tier contract, didn't you? You couldn't just stick to smuggling illegal spices or pirated hollows. A plasma bolt hissed past my ear, vaporizing a chunk of the container and showering me in molten metal. I scrambled further back, pulling my vintage snub-nosed blaster from its holster. It was a piece of junk, honestly, but it had a personality. Mostly its personality was unreliable, but it was all I had. Stop right there, Thorn, a voice echoed through the tunnel. It was amplified, cold and mechanical. Return the asset, and your death will be painless. Our employer is feeling uncharacteristically merciful today. Yeah, well, tell your boss I'm not a fan of his health insurance plan, I yelled back, blind firing a shot around the corner. The red bolt splashed harmlessly against a riot shield. I was cornered. The tunnel ended in a reinforced security gate that required a Tier 5 clearance I definitely didn't have. I looked up at the ceiling, searching for a vent, a pipe, anything. Nothing but darkness and the dripping of mystery fluids. Suddenly, a shadow dropped from the rafters. It wasn't a cleaner. It was a flash of silver and amber. Nyx landed with impossible grace, her feet making no sound on the metal. She was covered in a faint, shimmering haze of blue sparks. She didn't say a word. She just moved. The first cleaner didn't even have time to raise his rifle. Nyx was inside his guard in a heartbeat. She grabbed the barrel of his gun, and a massive arc of blue electricity jumped from her hands into the weapon. The rifle exploded in a shower of sparks, and the man collapsed, his nervous system completely fried. She whirled, her leg connecting with the second man's helmet with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The visor shattered, and he went down hard. The other two cleaners froze, their scanners struggling to track her movement. "Xylo-Thane!" one of them screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "Target is non-human. Use the disruptors." Nyx's jaw filaments flared. She didn't wait for them to adjust their weapons. She lunged forward, her body twisting in midair. She looked less like a person and more like a storm given human shape. In less than 10 seconds, 4 of the galaxy's most expensive mercenaries were twitching heaps on the floor. She turned to me, her amber eyes glowing fiercely in the dim light. She wasn't breathing hard. She wasn't even sweating. But the blue sparks dancing across her skin were more intense now, a warning sign that she was overloaded. "The gate," she commanded, pointing a shimmering finger at the security door. I don't have the code," I stammered, staring at the carnage she'd left behind. She walked past me, the air around her humming with static. She placed her palm directly onto the security console. For a second, nothing happened. Then the console screamed. Sparks flew from the keypad. The screen turned a bright, jagged white, and with a groan of protesting metal, the gate hissed open. "Show off," I whispered, though I was mostly just terrified. "Move, Scavenger," she said, her voice tight with strain. "My internal capacitors are at 80% capacity. If I don't vent this energy soon, I will level this entire corridor." Right. This way. Bay 94 is just around the bend." We sprinted through the open gate and into the docking ring. The stray light was waiting for us, her hull a patchwork of mismatched plates and faded paint, looking like a miracle held together by duct tape and stubbornness. I punched the remote start on my comm unit, and the ship's engines groaned to life with a familiar, coughing roar. "Beautiful, isn't she?" I said, gesturing to the ship as we reached the ramp. "It is a pile of scrap held together by hope," Nyx said, stepping onto the ramp. "I have seen better-looking debris in a junkyard." "Hey, she's got character," I defended, following her inside and slamming the hatch closed. "And she's fast. That's all that matters when people are shooting at you." I scrambled into the pilot's seat, my hands flying over the controls. "All right, girl, don't fail me now. Give me everything you've got." The ship shuddered as the thrusters engaged. On the sensor screen, I could see 2 ether sync interceptors launching from the hub's upper bays. They were sleek, black, and armed with enough firepower to turn us into stardust. "Nyx, get to the gunner's seat. I need you to keep them off our tail while I line up the jump." "I do not use human weapon systems," she said, standing behind me, her hands gripping the back of my seat. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, even through the flight suit. "They are slow and inefficient." "Well, unless you can throw lightning bolts through the hull, you're going to have to make do," I shouted, pulling the ship into a hard bank as the first volley of plasma fire rocked the ship. "Sector 94 is a mess of debris. I'm going to lose them in the scrap heap. Just keep them busy." She stared at the gunner's console for a moment, her filaments twitching in disgust. Then she sat down and slid her fingers into the manual overrides. "Adjusting tracking parameters. Your targeting computer is 3 generations out of date." Yeah, join the club," I grunted, pushing the throttles to the firewall. The stray light screamed as we plunged into the debris field surrounding Orizon. Massive chunks of rock and twisted metal flew past us, illuminated by the flashes of the interceptor's cannons. I wove through the chaos, using every trick I'd learned in 10 years of scavenging. Behind us, Nyx was doing something I'd never seen before. She wasn't just firing the cannons, she was pulsing them. The shots were timed perfectly, hitting the interceptor's shields at their weakest points. It was surgical. It was beautiful. "Target 1 disabled," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "Target 2 is breaking off." "They are cowards." "Not cowards, Nyx, they're just smart. Nobody follows a thorn into the maw of the shatter." I pulled the ship into a steep climb, clearing the last of the debris. Ahead of us, the stars stretched out in a cold, beautiful expanse. The shatter lay before us, a graveyard of 1,000 ships, a place where the laws of physics were more like suggestions. "We're clear," I said, leaning back and wiping the sweat from my eyes. "Nice shooting, by the way. You might actually be worth that 20,000. "I am worth much more than that," she said, standing up and walking toward the back of the cockpit. She stopped and looked at me. Her amber eyes softened just a fraction. And Valen? Yeah? If you ever call this ship beautiful again while we are under fire, I will vent you out of the airlock. I grinned. Noted. So, about that biodrive, she didn't answer. She just walked toward the small crew quarters, her silver skin still shimmering with the fading remnants of the battle. She was a weapon, she'd said. A monster, the galaxy called her. But as I watched her walk away, I didn't see a weapon. I saw someone who was just as lost in the void as I was. Welcome to the stray light, Nix, I whispered to the empty cockpit. Try not to break anything, including me. I set the autopilot for the inner rim of the shatter. We had 48 hours before the biodrive's internal timer would wipe the data. 48 hours to figure out how to open a dead man's secret with a woman who could kill me with a touch. Yeah, this was going to be a fun trip. I stood up from the pilot's seat, the adrenaline finally starting to ebb away, replaced by a deep, bone-weary ache. My hands were still shaking slightly as I reached for my flask. Empty. Of course it was. I looked at the biodrive sitting on the navigation table. It looked so small, so insignificant against the backdrop of the swirling nebulae outside the viewport. Yet inside that little cylinder was a war between people who had too much power and people who just wanted to survive. I thought about the men Nix had killed. They were cleaners, sure. They would have killed me without a second thought. But seeing her move like that, it was a reminder of what she really was. A Xylo-Thane, a species designed for war, perfected for the kill. Why was she on Orizon? Why was she hiding in a dive bar? I walked toward the galley, hoping to find something that resembled food. The stray light was quiet now, the only sound the hum of the life support system and the occasional groan of the hull. I reached for a packet of protein mash, but my mind was elsewhere. I remembered the Epsilon Purge. Everyone did. It was the night the Xylo-Thane military was wiped out by their own creators. EtherSync had decided the weapon project was becoming too independent, too unpredictable. They'd sent in the droids to execute every last one of them. Nix was a survivor of a genocide. And here I was, asking her to plug her brain into the very technology that had tried to erase her people. I'm a real piece of work, aren't I? I muttered, leaning against the cold metal bulkhead. Self-reflection is a rare trait in humans, a voice said from the shadows of the corridor. I jumped, nearly dropping my protein mash. Nix was leaning against the doorway, her arms crossed. She'd removed her outer tactical vest, leaving her in a sleeveless gray flight suit. Her skin glowed faintly in the dim red light of the ship's night cycle. Up close, I could see the intricate patterns of the biocircuits etched into her shoulders and arms, delicate glowing lines that looked like a map of a city I'd never visited. Jesus, Nix, do you have to do that? The whole appearing out of thin air thing? You were making noise. It is difficult to rest when a human is talking to himself. Sorry, just thinking out loud. I held up the protein packet. Want some? It's flavored like something that might have once been a chicken. I do not require human sustenance in large quantities. My internal cells draw energy from the ship's ambient radiation. She walked into the galley, her movements still possessing that unsettling predatory fluidness. The biodrive, it is not just data, Valen. What do you mean? It is a ghost drive. It contains a neural map, a copy of a consciousness. That is why it requires a Xylo-Thane interface. It needs a living brain to act as a bridge. I froze. A neural map. Whose? I do not know yet, but whoever it is, they are screaming. She looked at me, her amber eyes burning with a strange intensity. When I touched the console on the station, I felt a flicker. Fear. Agony. This is not a job, Scavenger. This is a rescue mission for a soul. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's air conditioning. EtherSync. They've been experimenting with digital immortality. If that's what this is, then we are carrying something much more dangerous than credits, she finished. She took a step toward me, and instinctively, I took a step back. She noticed her jaw filaments twitching in a way that might have been a bitter smile. Smart man, she whispered. Keep your distance, Valen Thorn, for both our sakes. She turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the galley with my cold protein mash and a growing sense of dread. The shatter was a place where people went to get lost. But as I looked at the dark corridor where Nyx had disappeared, I realized that some things were lost for a reason, and some things once found could never be put back. The stray light groaned in a way that suggested she was reconsidering her career as a spacefaring vessel. We were deep into the inner ring of the shatter, a region of space where gravity was more of a polite suggestion than a fundamental law. Outside the viewport, the universe looked like it had been put through a molecular blender. Giant slabs of crystalline asteroid collided with the skeletal remains of ancient dreadnoughts, creating a swirling graveyard that stretched for thousands of kilometers. Navigating this mess was like trying to thread a needle while riding a bucking bronco during a seismic event. I gripped the flight controls, my knuckles white. My neural shunt was humming at the base of my skull, feeding me a raw stream of sensor data that made my brain feel like it was being scraped with a rusty spoon. Every time a stray piece of debris pinged off the hull, the sound echoed through the cockpit like a gunshot. "You are being too aggressive with the thruster compensation," Nyx said. She was leaning against the bulkhead, her arms crossed over her chest. The blue sparks that had been dancing across her skin earlier had settled into a low, rhythmic throb. She looked exhausted, though her amber eyes remained as sharp as obsidian shards. "You are fighting the turbulence instead of flowing with it. At this rate, you will burn out the stabilizers before we reach the eye." "Listen, Sunshine, I'm the one with the pilot's license," I snapped, then immediately regretted the bite in my voice. I adjusted the pitch, feeling the ship slide into a pocket of dead air. My license might be 3 years expired and issued by a government that no longer exists, but I know how to handle my girl. She likes a firm hand. "Your girl is screaming in agony," Nyx countered, moving closer to the pilot station. She didn't sit down, but the sheer presence of her made the cockpit feel smaller. The bioelectrical resonance she emitted was a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my teeth. "The portside manifold is leaking thermal fluid. If you do not ease the pressure, we will lose the engine entirely. Then we will be just another piece of junk floating in the big dark." I looked at the diagnostic screen. She was right. The manifold was pushing 95% capacity. I exhaled, my shoulders dropping as I eased the throttle back. The stray light let out a long, shuddering sigh of relief. "Fine. Point taken. I'll dial it back." I set the autopilot to maintain a holding pattern within the lee of a massive planetary fragment. For a moment, the chaotic noise of the debris field faded into a dull roar. I leaned back in the seat, rubbing my eyes. My head was pounding again. "Why are you doing this, Violin?" Nyx asked suddenly. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier aggression. "Doing what? Trying not to die? That's kind of a full-time hobby for me." "No. Why this contract? Why risk your life and your ship for a biodrive that clearly belongs to the most dangerous corporation in the sector? You are not a hero. You are a scavenger. Scavengers usually have better survival instincts." I looked out at the drifting wreckage of the shatter. It was easy to see myself in all that scrap. Broken pieces of something that once had a purpose, now just drifting in the cold. "Maybe I'm tired of just picking through the trash," I said, my voice sounding more tired than I intended. "Maybe I wanted to see if I could actually finish something for once. Something that matters. Or maybe you are trying to outrun a ghost," Nyx said. Her amber eyes seemed to pierce right through my skull, looking at the memories I kept locked away in the dark. I didn't answer. My mind drifted back years ago to a different ship and a different crew, the Vanguard 6. We had been the best extraction team in the Rim, or so we thought, until the mission on Velonis Prime. I could still see the red dust, still hear the screams over the comms when the radiation storm hit. I had been the pilot. I had seen the sensor readings. I knew the storm was coming, but I was too slow, too scared to make the call. I'd pulled the ship out early, leaving 3 of my teammates on the surface because the hull integrity was failing and my own heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I'd survived. They hadn't. Since then, I'd been running. Running from the guilt, running from the faces of the people I'd left behind. Every joke, every sarcastic comment, every reckless stunt was just another brick in the wall I'd built to keep the shame from crushing me. We all have ghosts, Nix, I said finally. Some of us just have better engines to stay ahead of them. She studied me for a long moment, the filaments along her jaw vibrating softly. You think you are a coward because you chose to live. My people think the same. To a Xylo-Thane, there is no greater sin than surviving when your squad is lost. They call it the broken code. It is why I was exiled. I turned the chair to face her. Wait, you were exiled for surviving? I was a commander, she said, her gaze dropping to her hands. The silver skin shimmered with a dull, melancholy light. My unit was ordered to purge a settlement on the border. Non-combatants, children. I refused. I told my squad to stand down. Ether Sync's overseers triggered the fail-safes in their neural links. I watched my entire unit seize and die in seconds. I was the only one whose link malfunctioned. I survived because I was a glitch. So they kicked you out because you had a conscience? I asked, feeling a strange surge of kinship with this terrifying silver woman. They kicked me out because I was a weapon that wouldn't fire, she corrected. A broken tool is useless. I spent 3 years on Orizon trying to forget that I was ever anything else. I thought if I stayed in the shadows, if I never touched anyone, never let anyone in, I could stop the screaming in my head. I reached out, my hand stopping just inches from her arm. I remembered her warning about the resonance, about the brain-melting static. I pulled my hand back, clenching it into a fist. We're a pair of real winners, aren't we? I said with a weak grin. A pilot who's scared of his own shadow, and a soldier who's too good for her own people. We should start a club. Nix looked at my retracted hand, her expression unreadable. You almost touched me. Force of habit. I'm a human. We're tactile creatures. We use touch to ground ourselves, to know that we're not alone. It is a weakness, she whispered. Is it? I looked at the biodrive on the table. It was pulsing with that rhythmic violet light again, like a heartbeat. If touch is a weakness, then why does that drive feel so cold? Why does it feel like it's begging for someone to reach out? Nix stepped toward the table, her eyes fixed on the obsidian cylinder. The resonance is growing stronger. The drive is reaching its expiration. If we do not begin the interface soon, the neural map will degrade. Whoever is inside will truly die. I stood up, the sarcasms and jokes falling away. All right, what do you need from me? I need you to keep the ship stable, she said, her voice becoming the commander again. Once I link my nervous system to the drive, I will be vulnerable. I will not be able to see or hear what is happening in the physical world. If Ether Sync finds us, if we hit a gravity well, I will not be able to pull myself out. You have my word, Nix. I might be a lot of things, but I won't leave you behind. Not again. Not anyone. She nodded once, a sharp military gesture. Then she sat cross-legged on the deck plating, placing the biodrive in her lap. She took a deep breath, and for the first time I saw her eyes close. I'll be in the chair, I said softly. I'm not going anywhere. I returned to the pilot seat and gripped the controls. The stray light hummed beneath me, a rickety, beautiful disaster of a ship. I looked at the sensor screen, watching the red blips of debris drift past. I was scared. My heart was doing that bird-flapping thing again. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't looking for an exit. I was staying. The interface began not with a bang, but with a whisper of ozone. I watched from the pilot's seat as Nix's skin underwent a terrifying transformation. The silver sheen didn't just glow, it began to flow. The biocircuitry etched into her flesh turned a blinding electric violet, matching the pulse of the biodrive. Thin filaments of light, like gossamer threads of lightning, erupted from her fingertips and burrowed into the obsidian casing of the cylinder. She let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream. It was a harmonized vibration, a chord of pure energy that made the ship's internal lights flicker and die. For a heartbeat, the cockpit was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the violent radiance of the woman on the floor. "Everything okay down there?" I yelled, my voice sounding small against the hum. No answer. Nix's head was tilted back, her mouth open in a silent gasp. Her amber eyes were wide, but the pupils had vanished, replaced by cascading lines of white code. She was gone. She was no longer in the room. She was a bridge, a living conductor between the physical world and the digital ghost trapped in the drive. I turned back to the sensors, trying to ignore the smell of burnt hair and static. We were 40 minutes into the drift, and the shatter was getting restless. A massive shelf of ice, at least 3 kilometers long, was slowly tumbling toward our position. I had to nudge the ship every few minutes, burning precious go juice to stay in the shadow of our planetary fragment. "Come on, Nix. Talk to me," I whispered. On the secondary monitor, a data stream began to scroll. It was gibberish to me, hexadecimal strings and biometric waveforms. But then, a window opened. A video file, corrupted and jagged, began to play. It was a man. He was old, his face a map of deep lines and sun-damaged skin. He was wearing a lab coat with the EtherSync logo, but it was torn and stained with something dark. "If you are seeing this," he said, his voice crackling with digital interference, "then I am already gone. My name is Dr. Xylo-Thane. I was the lead architect of the Xylo-Thane project. I am also a murderer." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Xylo-Thane. I knew that name. He was a legend in the field of biocybernetics, the man who had supposedly discovered the Xylo-Thane on a fringe world. "We didn't find them," the image of Thane continued, his eyes wide with a frantic, desperate light. "We made them. We took political dissidents, refugees, the unwanted children of the colonies. We rewrote their DNA. We turned their skin into sensors and their blood into conductors. We stripped away their memories and gave them the broken code so they would never stop fighting." A sharp gasp came from Nix. Her body arched off the deck, her fingers clawing at the air. The violet light intensified, turning a bruised, angry purple. "Nix!" I shouted, unbuckling my flight harness. I started to move toward her, but a surge of static threw me back into my seat. The air was becoming ionized, thick enough to choke on. "Stay back!" a voice screamed. It wasn't Nix's voice. It was a layering of hundreds of voices, a chorus of the lost. I scrambled back into the pilot seat, my heart hammering. The video on the monitor continued, the image of Thane flickering as the drive reached critical temperature. "The Xylo-Thane are not weapons," Thane said, tears tracking through the grime on his face. "They are people. Every one of them carries the neural echoes of the person they used to be. I have stored the original neural maps, the souls of the first generation, in this drive. If this data is uploaded to the resonance hub on Nexara, the fail-safes can be deactivated. They can remember who they were. They can be free." The video ended in a burst of white noise. I looked at Nix. She was trembling now, her entire body vibrating at a frequency that made the ship's glass viewports rattle. Tears of glowing violet fluid were streaming down her face. She was experiencing it. The memories of 1,000 stolen lives, the agony of the transformation, the weight of a history that had been erased. She was being crushed by the truth. "I have to help her," I thought. "But how? If I touch her, I'm dead. If I don't, she's lost." Suddenly, the proximity alarm began to wail, a high-pitched, insistent shriek that cut through the humming ozone. Crap. I turned back to the sensors. 2 blips. Fast. Coming in from the high orbital plane. They weren't interceptors this time. They were EtherSync Reapers, heavy assault craft designed for one thing: total annihilation. "Valen Thorn," a voice boomed over the emergency channel. It was a voice I hadn't heard in 5 years, a voice that belonged to my nightmares. "Kalen Vane." I froze. Kalen, Eris Vane's son, and the man I'd served under in the Vanguard 6, the man who had ordered the mission on Valanus Prime. "Kalen?" I whispered, my hand trembling on the comm switch. "Hello, Valen," the voice said, smooth and cold as a glacier. "I must say I'm impressed. I didn't think you had the stones to run this far. But you always were a survivor, weren't you? Even when everyone else was burning. What do you want, Kalen?" "You have my father's property, Valen, a drive he stole from the company. It's a very expensive piece of hardware, and the board wants it back. Hand it over, and I might forget about what happened on Valanus. I might even let you keep that scrap heap of a ship." "You left them there, Kalen?" I yelled, the anger finally breaking through the fear. "You gave the order to move. I just followed it, and you've been crying about it ever since, haven't you?" Kalen laughed, a dry, hollow sound. That's the difference between us, Valen. I accept what I am. I'm a man who does what is necessary. You're just a coward who likes to pretend he's a pilot. Now power down your shields and prepare to be boarded, or I'll vape you where you sit. I looked at Nyx. She was still deep in the trance, her body a conduit for the souls of her people. She was defenseless. If I surrendered, they would take her. They would take the drive, and they would turn her back into a mindless weapon. Or they would scrap her for parts. I looked at the Reapers closing in. They were 5 kilometers away. 4. 3. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a chance. All I had was a ship that was falling apart and a woman who had saved my life even though she didn't know how to be a person. I reached for the throttle. Not today, Kalen, I said, my voice low and steady. I slammed the engines into a hard burn, the stray light screaming as she leapt forward. I didn't run away from them. I ran straight into the heart of the debris field, toward the 3-kilometer ice shelf that was currently tumbling through the void. Valen, you idiot, Kalen's voice crackled over the comms. You'll kill yourself. Better that than being like you, I shouted back. I dove the ship into a narrow crevice in the ice, the hull scraping against the frozen surface with a sound that set my teeth on edge. The Reapers followed, their superior speed and advantage in open space, but a liability in the tight, jagged canyons of the debris. I was flying by instinct now, the neural shunt feeding me a chaotic blur of proximity warnings. I pushed the ship through maneuvers that shouldn't have been possible, banking around shards of crystal and dodging frozen methane clouds. Inside the cockpit, the resonance from Nyx was reaching a fever pitch. The violet light was so bright I could barely see the controls. Valen, her voice came through the comms, but it wasn't coming from her mouth. It was coming from the ship itself. It was coming from the ghost drive. Help! Me! I'm here, Nyx! I'm here! I yelled, though I knew she couldn't hear me with her ears. One of the Reapers fired a torpedo. I saw it on the screen, a glowing red dot tracking our heat signature. I didn't have flares. I didn't have point defense. I looked at a massive slab of derelict hull plating floating ahead. It was ancient, rusted, and at least 50 meters thick. Hold on, girl, I whispered. I pulled a hard G-turn, swinging the tail of the stray light around and using the ship's maneuvering thrusters to kick us behind the derelict plate. The torpedo slammed into the ancient metal, the explosion rocking the ship with enough force to throw me against the console. My head hit the glass, and for a second, the world went gray. When I opened my eyes, the ship was spinning. The cockpit was full of smoke. Nyx was on the floor, the threads of light connecting her to the drive starting to fray. The violet glow was fading, replaced by a dull, sickly gray. She was slipping away. The interface was failing, and the feedback was killing her. I unbuckled my harness and fell toward her, my legs feeling like lead. Nyx, wake up! She didn't move. Her skin felt cold, not the metallic cold of before, but the cold of a body that was shutting down. I looked at her hand. The filaments were still twitching, still trying to hold on to the data. I remembered what she'd said. Touch me and I will kill you. Your brain will melt. I looked at the drive. I looked at the woman who had chosen to be a glitch instead of a murderer. I didn't care about the credits anymore. I didn't care about the ship. I didn't even care about being a coward. I reached out and grabbed her hand. The world exploded. It wasn't a physical explosion. It was a sensory supernova. A billion volts of history slammed into my brain. I saw the faces of the children on the border. I felt the agonizing heat of the DNA resequencing. I heard the screams of 1,000 souls being folded into code. I saw Nyx, not as a mercenary, not as a weapon, but as a girl named Alara who liked the smell of rain and the sound of bells. The pain was beyond anything I'd ever imagined. It felt like my nervous system was being stripped of its insulation and dunked in acid. My vision went white, then black, then a color I didn't have a name for. But I didn't let go. I squeezed her hand, pouring everything I had, my fear, my guilt, my stubborn, stupid hope, into the connection. Alara, I screamed in the silence of my own mind. Come back. You're not a tool. You're not a weapon. You're a person. And I'm not leaving you. For a heartbeat, the universe stood still. The static stopped. The pain vanished. There was only the two of us, floating in a sea of violet light. Then the light shattered. I was slammed back into reality. I was on the floor of the cockpit, my heart racing so fast it felt like it would burst. My hand was still gripping Nyx's, but the sparks were gone. The biodrive was dark, its obsidian surface cracked and dull. Nyx gasped, her eyes snapping open. The amber was back, but it wasn't cold anymore. It was wet with tears. "Valen?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm here," I coughed, tasting blood in my mouth. "I'm here." You touched me," she said, staring at our joined hands. "You are still alive." "I'm a stubborn skag," I said, trying to smile. "Hard to kill." She didn't pull away. She squeezed my hand back, her fingers trembling. "I remember Valen. I remember my name. I remember everything." We didn't have time to celebrate. The ship groaned as a second torpedo from Kalen's Reaper slammed into our shields, which were currently at 12% and dropping. I scrambled back into the pilot's seat, my brain still buzzing from the resonance. I felt different. I could see the ship's systems in my mind's eye, the data flowing like a river. The interface hadn't just changed Nyx, it had changed me. "Nyx, get to the guns," I barked, my voice sounding more like a commander than I'd ever been. "We're not done yet." She stood up, her movements no longer liquid and predatory, but human and determined. She didn't say a word. She just sat in the gunner's chair and put her hands on the controls. "All right, Kalen," I said, looking at the black ship on the screen. "You wanted a fight? You got one, but you're not fighting a coward and a weapon anymore." I pushed the throttles forward. "You're fighting a crew." We dove back into the chaos of the ice field, two broken people in a broken ship, finally moving in sync. The stray light didn't groan this time. She sang. The eye of the shatter was not an eye at all. It was a throat, a massive swirling vortex of ionized gas and pulverized tectonic plates that roared with the silent fury of a dying star. The radiation here was thick enough to turn a man's bones to ash in 60 seconds if the hull plating failed. My sensors were screaming, a chaotic symphony of alarms that I eventually just muted. If we were going to die, I didn't need a computer to tell me the precise decibel level of our extinction. "We're hitting the ion wall in 30 seconds, I shouted over the groan of the structural supports. The stray light was vibrating so violently that my vision was beginning to blur. Every bolt in the cockpit seemed to be humming a different note of despair. "Nyx, if you've got any of that Xylo-Thane magic left, now would be the time to use it." Nyx was slumped in the gunner's seat, her chest heaving. The silver of her skin was dull, bruised by the violet veins of the ghost drive resonance that still pulsed beneath the surface. She looked less like a goddess of war and more like a ghost herself. "The shields are at 7%, she rasped. Her voice sounded like grinding glass. "The resonance, it's dampening the power flow. The ship thinks I am a surge. It is trying to ground me." "Well, tell the ship to get in line," I yelled, hauling back on the yoke as a shard of obsidian the size of a freighter bypassed our point defense and grazed the belly of the ship. The impact threw us both forward. I felt my shoulder pop, a hot flash of agony that made my world spin. One of the Reapers was still behind us. Kalen Vane was a lunatic, but he was a lunatic with a top-tier inertial dampener and a hull made of reinforced carbon nanotubes. He was weathering the storm far better than we were. "You can't make the jump, Valen." Kalen's voice crackled through the static, distorted by the radiation, but still carrying that smug, untouchable tone. "Your drive is misaligned. You hit that vortex and you'll be scattered across 3 sectors in 1 billion pieces. Just drop the girl in the drive. I'll give you a 5-minute head start." "Don't listen to him," Nyx whispered, her amber eyes finding mine through the haze of smoke filling the cockpit. "He is lying. He was always lying." "I know," I said, my teeth clenched so hard I thought they might shatter. "I know he is." But as I looked at the swirling maw of the vortex, a familiar, paralyzing cold began to seep into my marrow. It was the red dust of Veloni's prime all over again. I could see the Vanguard 6 on the scanners. their life signs flickering out one by one as I sat in the cockpit, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the disaster. I could have gone back. I could have tried one more pass. But I had looked at the sensor readings, saw the percentage of survival drop to 0, and I had fled. I was a scavenger because I was a survivor, and I was a survivor because I was a coward. That was the logic that had kept me alive for 32 years. Violin? Nix's voice was softer now, cutting through the roar of the engines. You are drifting. I can't do it, Nix. The math doesn't work. The hull integrity is at 40%. The vortex has a gravitational shear of over 9,000 units. We're going to be torn apart. Then let us be torn apart together, she said. She reached out, her hand hovering over the center console. Her filaments were vibrating with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. Valen, look at me. I turned my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps. You are not the man who ran from Velonis, she said. Her eyes were no longer the flat, cold amber of a mercenary. They were wide, vulnerable, and terrifyingly human. You are the man who touched me. You are the man who chose to see a person where everyone else saw a weapon. That man is not a coward. He is just someone who has been carrying too much weight for too long. Drop the weight, Valen. Fly the ship. Something snapped inside me. It wasn't the fear disappearing. It was the fear becoming irrelevant. The ghosts of the Vanguard 6 were still there, standing in the corners of my mind, but they weren't screaming anymore. They were just watching. I gripped the yoke, my fingers finding the familiar grooves. I felt the ship, every creak of her rusted ribs, every stutter of her failing heart. She wasn't a pile of scrap. She was my girl, and we were going home. All right, Ilara, I said, using her name for the first time. Hold on to your seat. This is going to be a bit of a bumpy ride. I didn't ease off the throttle. I pushed it past the safety stops, hearing the engines scream in a pitch that shouldn't have been physically possible. We didn't weave through the debris. We danced through it. I used the gravitational shear of the larger asteroids to slingshot us, gaining momentum with every turn. Kalen fired a full spread of torpedoes. I didn't even look at the screen. I felt the heat of them, the way they displaced the ionized gas, and I rolled the stray light into a vertical spiral, letting the torpedoes slam into a passing ice shelf. The explosion provided a brief window of atmospheric displacement, and I punched the engines, driving us straight into the throat of the vortex. The world turned white. It was like being inside a bell that was being struck by a hammer the size of a planet. The sound was everywhere, a deafening, bone-shaking roar that transcended hearing. I felt the hull buckling, heard the scream of tearing metal. Valen! Nix's voice was a needle of light in the darkness. I didn't let go. I felt her hand find mine in the blinding white, her fingers interlocked with mine. The resonance flared one last time, a brilliant violet sun that swallowed the cockpit, the ship, and the storm. Then there was only silence. The silence of deep space is different from the silence of a room. It is a heavy, pressurized thing that feels like it's trying to squeeze the thoughts right out of your skull. I woke up slumped over the console, the taste of copper in my mouth and a dull, throbbing heat behind my eyes. The cockpit was dark, save for the flickering red of the emergency lights and the faint, ghostly glow of the nebula we were currently drifting through. We had made it. The vortex had spat us out on the other side of the shatter, miles away from Kalen Vane in his Reapers. But the cost was written in the sparks falling from the ceiling and the ominous hiss of oxygen escaping somewhere in the aft section. Nix? I coughed, my voice a dry rasp. Nix, you still with me? There was no answer. I unbuckled my harness, my body protesting every movement. My shoulder was a screaming mess of bruised muscle, and I could feel a cold trickle of blood running down my forehead. I stumbled out of the chair, my boots clunking hollowly on the deck. Nix was lying in the gunner's seat, her head lolling to the side. At first I thought she was just unconscious, but then I saw the dark, shimmering pool of violet fluid on the floor beneath her. Void damned it, I whispered, the panic rising in my throat. I scrambled over to her, my hands hovering over her body. She had been hit by a piece of the console during the final transition, a jagged shard of transparasteel buried deep in her side. The wound was weeping that strange, iridescent blood. and her skin was ice cold. The touch me and I'll kill you rule was still ringing in the back of my head like a warning siren, but I ignored it. I had touched her in the interface, and I had survived. This was different, though. This wasn't a digital connection. This was meat and bone and blood. I reached out and gently pulled her from the seat, cradling her against my chest. Her body was surprisingly heavy, her muscles dense and metallic. I carried her toward the ship's small medbay, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Hang in there, Ilara. Don't you dare give up on me now. We just survived a goddamn black hole. You don't get to die because of a piece of glass. I laid her on the narrow surgical bed and hit the activation switch for the medical droid. Nothing happened. The medbay was dark, the power cells drained by the jump. Great, just great. I found a manual emergency kit under the bed and tore it open. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the diagnostic scanner. I ran it over her side, the screen flickering with warning icons. Internal hemorrhaging, neural feedback overload, systemic shock. She was dying. Her Xylo-Thane physiology was trying to repair the damage, but the resonance from the ghost drive had left her internal systems in shambles. She didn't have enough energy left to heal herself. I looked at her face. Her eyes were closed, her long silver lashes casting shadows on her cheeks. She looked so small in the dim light, so far removed from the lethal mercenary I'd met at Orison. I have to do this, I told myself. I have to be the pilot. I grabbed a pair of surgical shears and cut away the flight suit around the wound. The sight made my stomach turn. The shard was buried deep, inches away from her primary neural hub. If I pulled it out wrong, I'd sever her connection to her own body. If I left it in, she'd bleed out in 20 minutes. I found a bottle of local anesthetic and a spray sealer. I didn't have a droid to assist me. I didn't have a sterile environment. I just had a flickering emergency light and a pair of hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I reached for her hand again, seeking that grounding connection we'd found in the storm. As soon as my fingers touched her skin, a faint spark of violet jumped between us. Her eyes fluttered open, the amber dull and unfocused. "Valen," she whispered. "I'm here. I'm going to get that piece of glass out of you, okay? It's going to hurt, but you have to stay with me. You should not." She coughed, a spray of violet blood hitting her chin. The resonance, "It will burn you." "Let it burn," I said, my voice cracking. "I've been frozen for 3 years, Ilara. A little heat might do me some good." I gripped the edge of the transparasteel shard with a pair of forceps. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my racing heart. 1, 2, 3. I pulled. Nyx let out a strangled cry, her body arching off the bed. A surge of blue electricity erupted from her skin, slamming into me and throwing me across the medbay. I hit the far wall, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of white-hot needles. My nervous system felt like it was being rewired by a madman. I slumped to the floor, my lungs refusing to draw air. Every muscle in my body was locked in a painful spasm. "Valen!" Nyx's voice was a ragged sob. I forced myself to move. I dragged my body across the floor, inch by agonizing inch, until I reached the bed again. The shard was out, lying on the floor like a bloodied tooth. The wound was pouring violet fluid. I grabbed the spray sealer and emptied half the can into the gash. The foam hissed as it met her blood, expanding and hardening into a synthetic scab. I followed it with a neural patch, slap-shunting it onto the skin near the wound to stabilize her biocircuits. Her breathing began to slow, the frantic rhythm of her heart settling into a steady, if weak, beat. The violet veins beneath her skin faded, returning to a dull, metallic silver. I collapsed onto a stool, my head between my knees. I was shaking so hard the stool was rattling against the floor. You came back," she said softly. "I'm a glutton for punishment," I wheezed, wiping the sweat and blood from my eyes. "I told you, I'm not leaving you behind." She reached out, her fingers brushing against my arm. There was no spark this time, no shock, just the cool, smooth sensation of her skin. "Why?" she asked. "Why risk so much for a weapon?" I looked at her, really looked at her, because you're not a weapon, Alara. You're a person who was told she was a tool until she started believing it. And I'm a man who was told he was a coward until he started believing it. Maybe we're both wrong. She was quiet for a long time, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The stray light continued to drift, the silence of the nebula wrapping around us like a blanket. The souls in the drive, she said finally. They are still there. I can feel them. They are not just data, Violen. They are memories of families, of music, of the way the sun feels on your face. Ether Sync didn't just steal their lives, they stole their humanity. Then we're going to give it back, I said. We're going to Nexara. We're going to find that resonance hub, and we're going to flip the switch. It is a suicide mission, she said, but there was a flicker of hope in her voice. Nexara is the heart of Ether Sync territory. They will have a fleet waiting. Then it's a good thing I'm the best pilot you've ever met, isn't it? I grinned, despite the fact that my entire body felt like it had been run over by a tank. Nyx looked at me, and for the first time she didn't look away. A small, genuine smile touched the corners of her mouth. You are a very strange human, Valenthorn. I get that a lot. Now try to get some sleep. I need to go see if I can convince the life support system that we're still worth breathing for. I walked back to the cockpit, my boots heavy on the deck. The ship was a mess, the drive was cracked, and we were being hunted by a corporate army. But as I looked out at the stars, they didn't look so cold anymore. I wasn't running, I was flying. And for the first time in 3 years, I knew exactly where I was going. The journey to Nexara would take us 4 days through the most dangerous space in the sector. 4 days to repair the ship. 4 days to prepare for a battle we probably wouldn't win. But as I sat in the pilot's seat and felt the hum of the engines, I didn't feel like a scavenger. I felt like a man who finally had something worth fighting for. Over the next few hours, I worked on the ship's primary systems. I patched the hull with emergency foam, rerouted the power from the non-essential systems to the life support, and managed to coax the navigation computer back to life. It wasn't pretty, and the stray light looked more like a floating junkyard than ever, but she was airtight. I checked on Nyx every 30 minutes. She was sleeping deeply, her body focusing all its energy on healing the damage I'd patched up. The violet blood had stopped seeping, and her skin was starting to regain its metallic luster. I found myself sitting by her bed more than I should have, just watching her breathe. It was a strange feeling, being responsible for someone else's life. For 3 years, I'd only had to worry about myself, and I'd done a pretty poor job of even that. But with Nyx, everything felt different. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was caring, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. As I sat there, the ghost drive on the table nearby began to pulse with a low, soft light. It wasn't the angry violet of the interface. It was a gentle, flickering amber, almost like a candle. I reached out and touched the obsidian surface. I didn't feel the agony this time. I felt a soft resonance, a whisper of 1,000 voices that sounded like a summer breeze. They weren't screaming, they were waiting. We're coming, I whispered to the drive. Just hold on a little longer. I went back to the cockpit and began to plot the course for Nexara. It would be a series of short jumps, hopping from one debris field to the next to avoid the corporate scanners. It was a long shot, 1,000,000 to 1 chance. But I'd always liked those odds. By the end of the first day, the ship was as ready as she was ever going to be. Nyx woke up in the evening, her strength returning with the uncanny speed of her kind. She walked into the cockpit, her movements still a little stiff, and sat in the co-pilot's seat. How are the shields? She asked, her eyes scanning the diagnostics. 12%, I said. Best I could do with the spare parts we have. It will have to be enough. We sat in silence for a while, watching the stars crawl past the viewport. The nebula was behind us now, replaced by the dark, empty void of the inner rim. Valen? Nyx said suddenly. Yeah, on Orizon. When I told you that I would kill you if you touched me, I meant it. Not because I was angry, but because I was afraid. I know, I said. I was afraid too. But you did it anyway. I guess I'm just too stupid to be properly scared. I joked, but the humor didn't quite land. No, she said, her amber eyes locking onto mine. You are not stupid. You are brave. And I think, I think I am learning how to be brave too. I reached out, my hand covering hers on the armrest. She didn't flinch. She didn't spark. She just turned her hand over and interlaced her fingers with mine. "We're a hell of a team, Alara," I said. "Yes," she whispered. "We are." We flew on into the darkness, two broken souls moving toward a light that only we could see. The shatter was behind us, but the real battle was just beginning. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want to be anywhere else. The second day brought its own set of challenges. The life support system decided to start leaking CO2 in the cargo bay, and I spent 6 hours hanging upside down in a maintenance crawl space, trying to patch a pipe with a piece of old flight suit and some industrial adhesive. By the time I crawled out, I was covered in grease and soot, and my back felt like it had been hammered by a gravity well. Nyx was in the galley trying to make something edible out of the protein rations. She looked up as I stumbled in, her filaments twitching with amusement. "You look like a duster who lost a fight with a trash compactor," she said. "I feel like one," I grunted, collapsing into a chair. "Is that food? Or are you just practicing your chemical warfare?" "It is technically nutrition," she said, sliding a bowl of lukewarm gray mush toward me. "I have added some dried algae for flavor." I took a bite. It tasted like wet cardboard and despair. Delightful. My compliments to the chef. She sat across from me, her expression becoming serious. "I have been analyzing the data from the drive. The resonance hub on Nexara is heavily guarded. It is located in the Spire, the central command tower of the EtherSync headquarters. To reach it, we will have to penetrate 3 layers of orbital defense in a ground-based shielding network." "Simple enough," I said, my mouth full of cardboard mush. "We'll just knock on the front door and ask politely." "Valen, I am serious. Even with your piloting, the odds of us reaching the Spire are less than 5%. 5%? That's practically a guarantee in my book. Besides, we have a secret weapon." "And what is that?" "You," I said, looking her in the eye. "They're expecting a weapon, Alara. They're expecting a tool that they can control. They're not expecting a woman who remembers her name and has a reason to fight." She looked away, her silver skin shimmering with a faint, uncertain light. "I hope you are right. I know I am. Now, eat your mush. We have a planet to save." As the third day bled into the fourth, the tension on the ship grew palpable. We were approaching the Nexara system, and the corporate chatter on the long-range scanners was reaching a fever pitch. They knew we were coming. They just didn't know where or when. I spent the final hours of the journey in the medbay, double-checking our supplies and making sure Nyx was fully recovered. She was standing in the center of the room practicing her combat forms. Her movements were a blur of silver and light, a testament to the lethal grace of her species. But there was something different now. There was a deliberate, controlled focus that hadn't been there before. She wasn't fighting out of instinct anymore. She was fighting out of choice. "You ready?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I am as ready as I will ever be," she said, stopping her form and turning to me. "And you?" "I'm terrified," I said honestly, "but I'm ready." She walked over to me and placed her hands on my shoulders. I felt the warmth of her touch, the steady, grounding pulse of her energy. "Then let us go," she said. We returned to the cockpit and took our seats. Ahead of us, the Nexara system flared into view, a brilliant jewel of civilization and corruption hanging in the void. I gripped the yoke, my fingers steady. I felt the stray light hum beneath me, a rickety, beautiful disaster of a ship that was about to make history. "All right, girl," I whispered. "One more time." I pushed the throttles forward and we plunged into the lion's den. The Nexara system did not welcome visitors. It tolerated them only if they carried the correct encrypted tokens in a heavy enough purse. As the stray light dropped out of its final sublight jump, the sheer scale of the corporate blockade made my stomach perform a slow, nauseating roll. Nexara was a world encased in a cage of silver and light. Tens of thousands of orbital platforms, defense satellites, and patrol destroyers formed a glittering web around the planet, a testament to EtherSync's absolute grip on this sector of the galaxy. "We are 3 million kilometers from the primary outer perimeter," Nyx said. Her voice was steady, but I could see the way her fingers were digging into the armrests of the co-pilot's seat. The biocircuits on her neck were flickering a nervous, pale blue. They have already pinged our signature. 7 destroyers are moving to intercept. Only 7? I said, trying to force a grin that felt more like a grimace. I'm almost offended. I thought I was worth at least a dozen. Valen, this is not a joke, she whispered, turning to look at me. Her amber eyes were clouded with the weight of the soul she still carried in her mind. The ghost drive is reaching its resonance peak. If we do not reach the hub in the next 40 minutes, the feedback will incinerate the ship's core, and me along with it. Then we'd better stop chatting and start burning, I said. I slammed the throttles forward. The stray light didn't just move. She lunged. The engines, patched together with industrial adhesive and sheer spite, let out a howl that vibrated through the floorboards. I didn't head for the gaps in the blockade. That's what a smart pilot would do. Instead, I headed straight for the heaviest concentration of destroyers. "What are you doing?" Nix yelled as the first volley of long-range plasma fire illuminated the cockpit in a harsh, strobe light white. "The Thorn maneuver," I shouted back, banking the ship into a violent roll. "They expect us to run for the shadows. They're tracking our heat signature, but they can't track us if we're inside their own exhaust plumes." I dove the ship toward the nearest destroyer, a massive, blocky beast called the Aegis IV. We were so close I could see the individual welding seams on its hull. I tucked the stray light into the wake of its massive ion engines. The turbulence was incredible, a physical force that tried to rip the wings right off the fuselage, but it masked our signature perfectly. To the orbital scanners, we were just a flicker of engine noise from one of their own ships. "Clever," Nix muttered, her hands flying over the gunner's console. "But we cannot stay here forever. We are nearing the inner atmosphere." "I know. Nix, I need you to do something crazy." She looked at me, her filaments twitching. "More crazy than this?" "I need you to open the ghost drive. Just a crack. I need that violet resonance. If we can bleed that energy into our hull plating, it'll act like a refractive shield. We'll look like a ghost on their sensors. Literally." "That will expose me to the feedback again," she warned. It could scramble my neural hub permanently." "I know what I'm asking, Alara," I said, my voice softening as I met her gaze. "But I can't get us through that inner shield grid on my own. I need you, not the weapon. I need the person who remembers the bells." She stared at me for a heartbeat, then nodded. Her expression was one of grim determination. She reached for the drive, which was now glowing so brightly it was painful to look at. She didn't use the filaments this time. She simply placed her bare hands on the obsidian surface. The scream that tore from her throat was not human, nor was it Xylo-Thane. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated data. The cockpit exploded in a wave of violet light, and for a second, the stray light felt like it was no longer made of metal. We were a shimmering, translucent specter of a ship, a glitch in the reality of the Nexara blockade. "We're through!" I yelled, seeing the destroyer's sensor locks fall away in confusion. We plunged into the atmosphere, the hull screaming as it began to burn. The friction of the re-entry was a roar that drowned out everything else. I fought the yoke, my muscles tearing under the pressure. The stray light was falling, a meteor of scrap and stolen souls heading straight for the spire. Suddenly, the comm system shrieked to life. The interference was heavy, but the voice was unmistakable. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Valen," Kalen Vane said. His image appeared on the secondary monitor, flickering in the violet haze. "But you're flying a dead ship. Look at your stabilizers." I glanced at the diagnostic. He was right. The left stabilizer was melting, the heat of the re-entry peeling away the emergency foam I'd applied. We were starting to yaw, the ship spinning toward a catastrophic breakup. "Give it up, Valen," Kalen said, his voice dropping into a tone of mock sympathy. "You've done enough. You've proven you're not a total coward. Just eject. Leave the girl in the drive. My father's work deserves to be finished. Think of the credits. Think of the clean record I promised you. You could be a pilot again, a real one, not a scavenger hiding in the dirt." I looked at the spire, a needle of black glass rising out of the clouds ahead of us. Then I looked at Nix. She was slumped over the drive, her skin a pale, ghostly gray, her life force being drained to keep us invisible. She had sacrificed everything to give these souls a chance. And Kalen was offering me a way back to my old life. A life built on ignoring the screams. I remembered Velonis Prime. I remembered the red dust and the silence after I'd pulled the trigger on the engines and left my friends behind. I'd spent 3 years thinking that was the moment I became a coward. But I realized now as the wind howled through the cracks in the cockpit that I wasn't a coward because I'd survived. I was a coward because I'd stopped caring, and I wasn't that man anymore. "Kalen," I said, my voice calm and clear over the roar of the wind. "Yes, Valen? You can take your credits and your clean record and shove them into the nearest black hole." I slammed the comm switch, cutting him off. "Nix!" I yelled, reaching out and grabbing her shoulder. I felt the bite of the resonance, the stinging needles of her static skin, but I didn't let go. "Ilara, wake up! We're going in!" Her eyes snapped open, the amber burning with a fierce new light. She saw the stabilizer failing, saw the spire rushing up to meet us. She didn't panic. She didn't scream. She simply placed her hand over mine on the yoke. "Together," she whispered. "Together," I answered. We pulled the ship out of the dive, the stray light groaning as we leveled off just meters above the city's rooftops. We were a streak of violet fire tearing through the heart of Aethersync territory. The spire loomed ahead, its defensive turrets turning to track us. But they were too late. We weren't a ship anymore. We were a choice. We slammed into the docking bay of the spire at 300 kilometers an hour. The impact was a symphony of shattering glass and twisting metal. The world turned upside down, a whirlwind of smoke and fire, and then, mercifully, it all went black. The air in the spire smelled of expensive perfume and ozone, a jarring contrast to the wreckage of the stray light that now occupied the center of the pristine, marble-floored lobby. I crawled out of the shattered cockpit, my boots crunching on fragments of high-end transparent steel. My left arm was useless, hanging limp at my side, and my vision was swimming with dark spots, but I was alive. I turned back to the ship. The stray light was a ruin, her hull twisted and smoking, her engines finally silent. She had given everything she had to get us here. "Nix!" I coughed, stumbling toward the side of the ship. She was already out, standing near the ruins of the cargo hatch. She was holding the biodrive like it was a holy relic. Her silver skin was covered in soot and blood, and her flight suit was torn. But she stood tall. The violet glow from the drive was now a steady, pulsing hum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around us. "The resonance hub," she said, pointing toward a massive set of gold-leaf doors at the far end of the lobby. "It is behind those doors. We have to move before the security teams arrive. We didn't even make it halfway." The doors hissed open, and a squad of Aethersync security droids marched out, their sleek black carapaces gleaming in the overhead lights. Behind them walked Kalen Vane. He looked exactly as he had in my nightmares. Impeccably dressed, his eyes cold and calculating. A man who saw the world as a series of assets and liabilities. "Valen," he said, shaking his head, "you really are a stubborn piece of work. You destroyed a multi-million credit docking bay in a perfectly functional ship just to hand me the drive in person?" "I'm touched. It's not for you, Kalen," I said, leaning against a pillar to keep from collapsing. "We're uploading the data. We're letting them go." Kalen laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no humor in it. "Letting them go? You think those souls want to be free in a world like this? They are the foundation of the next stage of human evolution. My father's work will ensure that no one ever has to fear death again. We will be gods, Valen. And you want to throw that away for a few thousand ghosts?" "They're not ghosts," Nyx shouted, her voice echoing through the massive hall. "They are people. You stole their names, their memories, their very right to exist. You didn't conquer death, Kalen. You just invented a new way to be a monster." Kalen's expression darkened. The droids raised their weapons. "Enough. Give me the drive, or I will have the droids peel the skin off your bones." I've always wondered what a Xylo-Thane looks like on the inside. I looked at Nyx. She looked at me. There were no words needed. We both knew what had to happen. "I'll hold them off," I whispered. "You get to the hub." "Valen, no," she started, but I cut her off. "Go. This is the Thorn maneuver. Remember? The crazy pilot does the stupid thing so the hero can save the day. That's how it works. I pulled my snub-nosed blaster from its holster. It was cracked, its power cell leaking, but it still had a few shots left. I stepped out from behind the pillar, my feet planted wide. "Kalen," I yelled. "You want the drive? Come and get it." I started firing. The snub-nose roared, each shot a defiant scream against the sterile silence of the spire. The droids returned fire, plasma bolts sizzling past me, scorching the marble and filling the air with the smell of burnt stone. Nyx didn't hesitate. She bolted for the hub, her silver body a blur of speed and light. She hit the first line of droids like a kinetic strike, her hands glowing with blue static. She didn't kill them. She shorted them out, her movements a surgical dance of efficiency. I kept firing, my good arm shaking with the effort. A plasma bolt caught me in the thigh, and I went down on one knee, a groan of agony escaping my lips. I didn't stop. I fired until the blaster let out a dry, empty click. "Violin!" Kalen shouted, drawing a sleek silver pistol from his hip. "You're a fool. You're dying for a woman who can't even touch you without killing you." I looked up at him, the blood from the cut on my forehead blurring my vision. I didn't see a powerful executive. I saw a man who was more of a tool than Nyx could ever be. "Maybe," I coughed, a red mist spraying from my lips. "But at least I know what it feels like to try." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a small, round object. It was the thermal detonator I'd scavenged from the Aegis IV's debris. I hadn't told Nyx I had it. "I'm not a coward, Kalen," I whispered. "I'm just a scavenger, and scavengers always keep a little something for a rainy day." I thumbed the activator. The lobby of the spire was filled with a blinding golden light. The explosion wasn't enough to bring down the building, but it was enough to shatter the droids and throw Kalen Vane across the room like a rag doll. I was thrown back by the blast, hitting the ruins of the stray light with a bone-crunching thud. I lay there, the world spinning in slow motion, watching the ceiling panels fall like snow. In the distance, I heard a sound. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a scream. It was a low, resonant chime, like 1,000 bells ringing at once. The hub. I looked toward the golden doors. They were open. Nyx was standing in the center of a pillar of violet light that rose from the floor and pierced the ceiling. The ghost drive was gone, dissolved into a swirling cloud of glowing particles that were flowing into the spire's central computer core. The souls were escaping. I could see them, not as code, but as shimmering outlines of people. Men, women, children. They were drifting upward, passing through the walls of the spire, spreading out over the city of Nexara like a fall of starlight. They were free. I felt a cool, soft pressure on my cheek. I forced my eyes open. Nyx was kneeling over me. Her silver skin was glowing with a gentle, warm light, the violet veins completely gone. She looked beautiful. She looked like the girl who liked the smell of rain. "Violin," she whispered, her voice a soft, melodic hum. Did we do it?" I asked, the words feeling heavy in my mouth. "Yes," she said, her amber eyes wet with tears. "They are gone. All of them. And the hub, it has sent a signal to every Xylo-Thane in the sector. The broken code is deactivated. They are remembering, Valen. All over the galaxy, they are remembering who they are." "Good," I said, a slow, tired smile spreading across my face. That's a good day's work." She reached down and took my hand. I braced myself for the shock, for the brain-melting static of the resonance. But there was nothing. No spark, no pain. Just the warm, solid feel of her skin against mine. You're not sparking," I whispered, amazed. "The interface. It changed me," she said, her fingers interlacing with mine. "I am no longer a weapon, Valen. I am just me." She leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture of tenderness that felt more powerful than any engine I'd ever flown. "Thank you," she whispered. I closed my eyes, the darkness finally starting to feel like a friend instead of an enemy. I was a scavenger. I was a pilot. I was a man who had left people behind. But as I lay there in the ruins of my ship, with the hand of a woman who loved me in mine, I realized that my flaws weren't what made me weak. They were what made me human. And being human was the bravest thing I'd ever done. We stayed like that for a long time, as the city of Nexara burned with the light of 1,000 returning souls. The corporate guards were coming, the fleet was still in orbit, and we were trapped in the heart of the enemy's fortress. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid. I had found my ground. Over the next 30 minutes, the silence of the lobby was broken only by the distant sounds of alarms and the crackle of burning debris. Nyx stayed by my side, her hand never leaving mine. She used her remaining bioelectrical energy to cauterize the wound in my leg, her touch gentle and sure. "Valen," she said, her voice sounding stronger now. "We cannot stay here. Kalen is unconscious, but his reinforcements will be here soon." "I know," I groaned, trying to sit up. "But I'm not exactly in marathon running shape, Alara." "You do not have to run," she said, helping me to my feet. "Look." I followed her gaze to the wreckage of the stray light. Something was happening. The ship's emergency backup systems had kicked in, and the central AI, which I'd named Betsy, in a moment of drunken sentimentality, was flickering on the console. "Manual escape pod initialized," the computer's voice said, sounding surprisingly clear. "Sector 14G, launch in 90 seconds. I laughed, a painful, wheezing sound. Good old Betsy. She always did have a sense of timing. We limped toward the back of the ship, where the small, cramped escape pod was located. It was designed for one person, but as I'd told Nyx before, I was very good at sharing. We squeezed into the pod, the smell of burnt plastic and old coffee wrapping around us like a familiar blanket. I punched the launch sequence with my good hand. "Are you sure about this?" Nyx asked as the pod's thrusters began to whine. "I'm a pilot," I said, leaning my head back against the seat. "I'm never sure about anything. That's the fun part." The pod launched with a violent jolt, throwing us back into the seats. We tore through the shattered window of the lobby and out into the Nexara sky. Below us, the city was a sea of lights, but the starlight was still falling, a beautiful, silent rain of freedom. "Where are we going?" Nyx asked, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Anywhere but here," I said. "I've heard the Rim is nice this time of year. Lots of junk to scavenge. Lots of stories to tell." She looked at me and smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her amber eyes. "I would like that," she said. The pod cleared the atmosphere, its small engines pushing us out into the big dark. Behind us, the spire was a dark needle in a world of light. Ahead of us, the stars were waiting. We were two broken people in a tiny metal box, drifting in a universe that didn't care if we lived or died. But as I felt Nyx's head rest on my shoulder, I knew that we weren't just surviving. We were home. The journey was long, and the air in the pod was thin, but we didn't mind. We spent the time talking, not about the mission or the drive, but about the things we wanted to see. The waterfalls of Thaloris, the singing crystals of Xylos, the way the rain smelled on a small, unimportant planet called Earth. We were learning how to be people, and it was the hardest, most beautiful job I'd ever had. As the sun of a new system began to rise over the edge of the pod's viewport, I looked at the woman beside me. She was sleeping, her silver skin shimmering with the light of 100 different worlds. I reached out and touched her hand, a simple, friendly touch. She didn't wake up. She just squeezed my fingers in her sleep. "Touch me again," I whispered to the empty pod. And I did. The escape pod drifted on, a tiny spark of hope in the vast, cold emptiness of space. We didn't know what the future held. We didn't know if we'd ever be truly safe. But as I watched the stars, I realized that it didn't matter. We had the key, and we weren't afraid to use it. The escape pod was a cramped, vibrating coffin of orange-painted metal, and it was currently the most beautiful place in the entire galaxy. We were 4 hours out from Nexara, drifting in the silent, cold shadow of a gas giant named Oros. The planet was a massive, swirling marble of gold and violet clouds, looming so large in the viewport that it felt like we were about to be swallowed by a god. I was slumped against the padded wall, my breath hitching in my chest. Every time I moved, a new fire started in my ribs. My left arm was still useless, tucked into the front of my torn jacket, and my leg was a dull, throbbing weight. But I was breathing. The air in the pod was thin and smelled of recycled sweat and burnt wiring, yet it was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted. Nick sat across from me, her back against the emergency hatch. The amber glow of the gas giant reflected off her silver skin, making her look like a statue carved from moonlight. She wasn't moving. For a long time, I thought she had gone into a neural shutdown, her eyes fixed on the small, flickering status screen of the pod. "Ilara?" I whispered. She turned her head slowly. The amber in her eyes was deep and clear, no longer clouded by the static of the ghost drive or the cold calculation of the mercenary. She looked at me, and I felt a strange, fluttering sensation in my chest that had nothing to do with my injuries. "I am here, Valen," she said. Her voice was no longer a harmonized hum. It was just a voice, soft, a little tired, and undeniably real. "You okay? I mean, besides the whole crashing a ship and blowing up a corporate lobby thing?" She looked down at her hands. She opened and closed them, watching the way the light played across her palms. "I can feel everything," she said. "For the first time since the transformation on Valonus Prime, the noise has stopped. The voices of the souls. They are not gone, Valen. They are just dispersed. I can still feel them out there, like a faint resonance in the background radiation. They are free." "And the Xylo-Thane?" I asked, leaning my head back against the metal. "They are waking up. The signal I sent through the hub, it didn't just delete the code, it restored the bridge. All over the sector, thousands of my kind are realizing that they have a choice. They are realizing that their skin is not a prison, and their hands are not just for killing." I let out a long, shaky exhale. "Well, I guess that makes us the most wanted people in history. EtherSync isn't going to let this go. They've lost their most expensive assets and their biggest secret in one afternoon." "Let them come," she said, and there was a quiet, unshakable strength in her words. "We are no longer the prey they remember." I reached out with my good hand, my fingers brushing against the cold deck plating between us. I wanted to touch her, to feel the warmth I'd felt in the spire, but the old habit of fear still lingered. I was a scavenger, a man who survived by knowing exactly where the boundaries were. And for 3 years, she had been the most dangerous boundary in the galaxy. She saw the hesitation in my eyes. She didn't wait for me to move. She reached across the small space and placed her hand over mine. It was warm, solid. There was no surge of static, no agonizing feedback, no brain-melting resonance. There was just the skin-to-skin contact of two people who had nearly died for each other. I looked at our hands, mine scarred and grease-stained, hers silver and elegant. I felt a lump form in my throat. For 3 years, I'd been running from the memory of the people I couldn't save. I'd built a life out of junk and sarcasms, convinced that if I just moved fast enough and laughed loud enough, I could outrun the coward I thought I was. But sitting in that tiny pod, with Alara's hand in mine, I realized that I hadn't been running from death. I'd been running from the possibility of being hurt again. I'd been so scared of losing someone else that I'd stopped letting anyone in. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice cracking. "For what? For being such a scag for the first 2 days," I said, a weak laugh bubbling up in my throat. "For calling you a weapon. For being too stupid to see the person right in front of me." Nix's fingers tightened around mine. "You were not stupid, Valen. You were protecting yourself, just as I was. We were both built by our traumas. You used jokes, and I used a blade. But in the end, we both chose to let them go." She leaned forward, her forehead coming to rest against mine. It was a Xylo-Thane gesture of absolute trust, one I'd seen in the Ghost Drive's memories. It felt like an anchor. "You are the bravest man I have ever known," she whispered. "I'm just a pilot who got lucky," I said, though for the first time in my life, I didn't entirely believe the lie. We drifted in silence for another hour, watching the gold and violet clouds of Oros roll beneath us. The pod's sensors began to beep, a low rhythmic sound that indicated a ship was approaching. I tensed, my hand instinctively reaching for the empty holster at my hip. "If it's Kalen—" "It is not Kalen," Nix said, her eyes fixed on the sensor readout. "It is an independent freighter. The signature is familiar." A moment later, the comm system sputtered to life. A voice came through the static, a gravelly old man growl that made me sit up so fast I nearly blacked out from the pain in my ribs. Escape Pod 79 Delta, this is the heavy lifter Mule's Breath. You look like you've seen better days. Do you require assistance, or are you just enjoying the view? Captain Silas, I gasped, grabbing the comm unit. Silas, you old duster, is that you? Valen? Valen Thorne? Void damned it, boy. I thought you'd gone and got yourself spaced a year ago. We saw the fireworks over Nexara from 3 sectors away. The whole galaxy is talking about the crazy pilot who rammed the spire. Yeah, that was me, I said, a genuine grin spreading across my face. I've got a friend with me, Silas. We need a lift, and maybe a very large bottle of whatever you're hiding in the medical locker. Consider it done, kid. Bringing the tractor beam online. Sit tight. And Valen? Yeah? Good to have you back among the living. The pod shuddered as the tractor beam locked on, and we began the slow, steady pull toward the airlock of the Mule's Breath. I looked at Nyx, and she looked at me. The journey wasn't over. Ether Sync would still be hunting us. The Xylo-Thane were still in the middle of a revolution, and we were still a pair of broken people with no money and a long list of enemies. But as the airlock door of the freighter hissed open, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't running anymore. 1 year later, the moon of Thaloris was a world of silver forests and emerald seas, located so far on the edge of the outer rim that even the most ambitious corporate scouts didn't bother to chart it. It was a quiet place, a place where the wind sounded like bells and the rain smelled of ozone and wild jasmine. I was standing on the landing pad of our small settlement, the sun of Thaloris setting behind the mountains in a blaze of copper and gold. The air was cool and the scent of the sea was heavy on the breeze. In my hand, I held a hydro wrench, its metal warm from a long day of work. The Stray Light Mark II, a heavily modified interceptor I'd built from 3 different wrecks and a lot of stubbornness, was sitting on the pad behind me. She wasn't as pretty as the original, but she was faster, tougher, and her stabilizers actually worked. Valen! A voice called out from the edge of the forest. I turned and saw Alara walking toward me. She was wearing a simple tunic of woven fiber, her silver skin glowing softly in the twilight. She looked healthy, her movements fluid and relaxed. She wasn't carrying a blade anymore. In her arms, she held a basket of blue-tinted fruit she'd gathered from the woods. The solar arrays are fixed, she said, stopping beside me. The settlement will have full power through the monsoon season. Good, I said, wiping a smudge of grease from my forehead. I just finished the calibration on the Mark II's navigation array. She's ready for the run to the hub tomorrow. Every month we made a trip to the nearest independent station to trade supplies and check in on the growing Xylo-Thane community. It had been a slow, difficult process, helping thousands of people who had been weapons for their entire lives learn how to be something else. But they were doing it. They were building farms, schools, and even a few art galleries. You're thinking about Kalen again, Alara said, her eyes searching mine. I shrugged, leaning against the hull of the ship. Hard not to. The news from the inner core says EtherSync is still in court battle over the Ghost Drive scandal. Kalen's father's name has been stripped from the history books, and Kalen himself is, well, he's still out there somewhere, probably plotting his revenge. Let him plot, she said, placing her hand on my shoulder. We are not hiding, Valen. We are living. There is a difference. I looked at her hand. I still marveled at the fact that I could feel the warmth of her skin without the fear of death. The resonance hadn't gone away entirely. Sometimes when we were close, I could feel a faint, gentle hum, like the purr of a well-tuned engine. But it wasn't a warning anymore. It was a connection. I set the hydro wrench down on a crate and took both of her hands in mine. I looked around at the small collection of huts, the gardens, and the flickering lights of the other settlers. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I didn't feel like I needed a drink to dull the memories or a joke to keep people at a distance. I was 33 years old and I finally knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. I wanted to be the man who stayed. I remember the first time I saw the spire from the cockpit of the pod, I said softly. I remember thinking that I'd finally reached the end of my luck, that everything I'd done, the scavenging, the lying, the running, had led me to that one moment of absolute failure. And now? Ilara asked. And now I realized that it wasn't a failure. It was a forge. I had to be broken down to the very base of who I was before I could start building something that actually mattered. I spent so many years trying to be a hero or a survivor, but in the end, the only thing that saved me was being human. Just a plain, flawed, scared human who decided that someone else was worth more than his own skin. I took a deep breath, the scent of the silver forest filling my lungs. I looked at the stars as they began to blink into existence above the mountains. I used to look at the sky and see 1,000 ways to get lost, I thought to myself. I saw the big dark as a place to hide, a vast empty theater where my mistakes didn't have an audience. I thought my scars were my identity, that the weight of the people I'd left behind was the only thing that made me real. I spent 3 years convinced that my heart was just another piece of junk I'd picked up along the way, cracked, unreliable, and not worth the effort of repairing. But standing here, with the dirt of a new world under my fingernails and the hand of a woman who knows every one of my flaws and mine, I understand the truth. Courage isn't the absence of fear. I'm still scared every time the sensor pings a new ship. And strength isn't the absence of weakness. My arm still aches, and I still have nights where the red dust of Velonis haunts my sleep. True courage is looking at your own broken pieces and deciding they can still be used to build a home. It's realizing that the very things you thought made you unworthy, your fear, your guilt, your capacity to be hurt, are the only things that allow you to truly connect with someone else. We are all just scavengers in this universe, picking through the wreckage of our lives. But if we're lucky, we find someone who's willing to help us turn that scrap into something beautiful. I turned back to Ilara. She was watching me with an expression of such profound tenderness that it made my breath hitch. "Come on," she said, tugging gently on my hand. "The others are waiting. It's a festival night." I smiled, a real unguarded smile. "I'm coming. Just let me lock up the girl first." I turned the master switch on the Mark II, the engines letting out a soft, satisfied click as they powered down. I walked away from the ship, not looking back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where she was, and I knew exactly where I was going. As we walked toward the center of the settlement, I looked at the flickering fires and heard the sound of laughter and music. It was a messy, loud, imperfect community built by people who had every reason to be afraid of each other. But they were here anyway. They were trying. I spent 33 years thinking my flaws were a cage, but they were actually a map. They led me right where I needed to be. I wonder, as you look at your own journey, have you been hiding the parts of yourself that you think are broken? Have you been running from your own scars, thinking they make you less worthy of the light? What if those very flaws are the keys to the doors you've been trying to open? What if the thing you are most afraid of showing the world is the very thing that will finally allow you to be found? I reached out and interlaced my fingers with Ilara's, the warmth of her hand a constant, living promise. We walked into the light of the festival together, two scavengers who had finally found the one thing they couldn't live without. We weren't perfect, and the galaxy was still a dangerous place. But as I looked at the woman beside me, I knew we had everything we needed. I leaned in and kissed her, right there in the middle of the crowded square. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care who was watching. The sun of Thaloris vanished behind the horizon, leaving the world in a beautiful, star-lit glow. I picked up a blue fruit from the basket, took a bite, and laughed.